desire for a scoop at all. The principal motivation for my trip to Vietnam was to get, for the American public and for the public at large, a closer look at what was happening in an area of the world with which we were vitally connected. In other words, it was a desire for more full information on which Americans could base their conclusions so far as foreign policy was concerned, in which we're deeply, deeply involved. Scoops, I think, are a little bit out of style in the newspaper business these days. Initiative or an effort to find out what lies behind a war, a conflict, a diplomatic intrigue. These, I think, are the basic factors. Certainly they're the basic factors as far as I'm concerned.
Why do you feel that the North Vietnamese government allowed you, over other correspondents who made the same request, entry to North Vietnam? Do you think that the permission was granted because of either your own reputation or because of the prestige of the New York Times?
I think quite clearly the prestige of the New York Times was a basic factor in the decision. I think that for a long time the North Vietnamese government pondered whether it should permit an American correspondent to come to Hanoi. When they finally reached the decision that they would take this step, they decided they would prefer to have someone from the Times. So far as I personally was concerned, I think that the reason that they picked me over another possibility, which was Seymour Topping, our foreign editor, who had also applied for permission to enter, I think the reason they took me was that I had been more persistent and had been working at it perhaps for a longer period of time than Mr. Topping had.
Do you feel that one of the major reasons that Hanoi agreed to grant you a visa perhaps was for propaganda purposes?
I think that propaganda was a factor involved in this. I've been covering the communist world for about 25 years, and I've never known Moscow or Peking or any communist government to give a correspondent permission to visit their country unless they hoped in some way to benefit by that act. At the same time, I have never known an American correspondent, certainly a correspondent for the Times, who was not aware of this and realized that this had to be a two-way proposition. And I think this was a factor in the decision of the Hanoi government. I think there was another factor involved too, which perhaps didn't come out as clearly as it might have. I believe that in the fall of 1966, the Hanoi government was approaching a major decision as to whether to continue to carry on the war without change, or whether it might wish to explore the possibility with the United States for some sort of diplomatic negotiations. And I think that they felt that a visit by an American correspondent to Hanoi might cause some change in the international atmosphere which would facilitate this kind of investigation.
How sure could you be that the facts and figures supplied by the Hanoi government were at all accurate?
Well, the facts and figures provided by any government, particularly a communist government, are always subject to scrutiny and possible skepticism. The only way one can be fairly certain is to match them up against what you might call the law of probability. So far as Hanoi's figures were concerned, so far as the figures on civilian casualties, for example, were concerned, I think we have some measure of check. For example, I saw some areas of damage in Hanoi itself, where houses had been knocked down by bombs or rockets. In one street, for example, there were 8 or 10 houses that had been demolished. Now, in the destruction of those houses, they gave the casualties as something like 4 or 5 people killed, and I think 8 or 9 injured. Now, considering the population in these houses, this sounds like a fairly reasonable contention. In some of the larger areas where casualties were reported, let's say the city of Nam Dinh, in which there had been repeated American air attacks, 52, 53, or something like that at the time I was there, they gave a total of deaths of 89. Well, if you work that out on the basis of the number of raids it works out at a little bit more than a casualty and a half or something like that per raid. This again sounds like a low figure. The general casualty figures which they gave me actually were so low that the Pentagon in Washington used these figures, which were communist figures, as an argument to demonstrate the precision of our bombing and the care with which we were attempting to prevent civilian casualties from occurring.
Why, at the start of your reports, did you not cite the sources of your information?
Well, this question relates to the question of sourcing the casualty reports in Hanoi, I believe, and perhaps Nam Dinh on the first couple of dispatches that I wrote. The source, of course, in both cases were the municipal officials in these cities, communist officials. And I didn't put the actual source in the case of these dispatches, really, because the dispatches were written in a great hurry in order to get them off and get them into the Times. And in fact, I did miss my deadline with one of these dispatches, even though I did hurry a great deal. I didn't think that the question of citing the specific source there was terribly important, although I included it generally in my dispatches, because the truth of the matter is there is only one place where you can get figures about casualties, and that is from the officials of the city or the country where the accident or the war or the damage occurs. And I think it was quite apparent to everyone who read these stories that the figures did come from some such source.
Did you have the opportunity to meet and discuss what you saw with any correspondents in Hanoi?
Yes, I did, and it was very useful to me. As a matter of fact, there is in Hanoi one permanent non-communist Western correspondent. He is the correspondent of the French news agency, the Agence France-Presse. He has been stationed in Hanoi for, I think for nearly a year now. Very experienced man who's gotten around the country a great deal, and a very solid and sound observer, in my opinion. And I was extremely fortunate in being able to discuss with him his own experiences as a correspondent there and relate and compare my impressions with his. As a matter of fact, he and I traveled about a bit in Vietnam and went to a number of the same places and examined the same sort of phenomena. So we had a chance of checking and cross-checking our observations. Also, it was very useful in Hanoi to check with the Western diplomats. I don't think many Americans realize that there is a non-communist diplomatic corps in Hanoi. This includes some Canadians who are members of the International Control Commission. It includes the British consulate and a rather large French consulate general. And there are a number of Asians, countries like India. The Egyptians are there, the Indonesians, quite a group of diverse diplomats, all of them with a lot of experience, and most of them with an opportunity to travel about the country a good deal, and with sources of information that are extremely useful to a correspondent coming in from the outside, so that I was able to check what I saw and what I was told against the impressions of these diplomats.
How did you transmit your reports from Hanoi? And did you have any fear at all that they would be either edited or censored by either Hanoi or the United States government?
The reports were all transmitted by a normal commercial wireless. There's a regular wireless circuit that operates between Hanoi and Paris, and I simply dispatched them to the New York Times office in Paris, where they were delivered by these commercial channels. When I first submitted the original dispatch or two, I was not at all certain that I wouldn't encounter censorship on the part of the Vietnamese. After all, it's a wartime country. I've been a war correspondent myself in many different countries, and it's usual in a country at war to subject dispatches to censorship. So that I was not sure for the first two or three whether they would be censored or not. I was not certain until I received back from my office in New York reports that the dispatches had been received, complete, that the text had not been tampered with. I was not at all worried about the United States interfering with the dispatches because, of course, we have no censorship in the United States, and I knew they would go directly to the New York Times. I was interested, however, in general in this question of censorship, and here is a place where the Agence France-Presse correspondent stood me in good stead. I thought that perhaps they were making a special exception for me and that they were letting my dispatches go through without censorship, whereas others were being censored. But the AFP man told me that in all the time he'd been in Hanoi, none of his dispatches had been censored either. We both agreed this was a curious and unusual situation because in all the wars that we've covered, we found censorship, generally it does apply.
While you were in Vietnam, were you aware of the criticism directed toward you and your reports? And if so, is that why your last few articles cited sources for your statistics?
Yes, I was aware of the criticism and also the praise that my articles were receiving in many parts of the world. My office in New York kept me informed daily about the reaction that the dispatches were arousing, particularly in Washington, where the reaction was rather sharp, and also in other parts of the world where the reaction was diverse, shall we say. I was also able to listen. I'd taken a shortwave radio receiver with me when I went to Hanoi, realizing that I was likely to be cut off from general sources of information, and I was able to listen to the BBC and the Voice of America and other of the world broadcasting systems reporting on my dispatches and the various reactions that were coming through on them. And I also had access, fortunately, to the incoming file of the Agence France-Presse, the French news agency, which was receiving reports on my dispatches and the play and the attention they were getting in various places around the world. So far as sourcing is concerned, I didn't insert any sources in my dispatches because of any criticism that was coming through. This is really quite a routine procedure for newspapermen. They put sources in where they seem to be of some significance, or even we do it just as a custom. And sometimes we leave them out too. It isn't a very important matter. In fact, I don't believe that anyone would ever have raised the question had it not been for a tendency in the Pentagon in Washington to try and find some sort of a grounds for criticism of the dispatches. I think they were probably rather apprehensive of the impact of these reports coming in as they did at considerable variance from the rather bland picture that their communiques had been giving.
When your articles began to appear in the Times, was any attempt made by an official or unofficial U.S. government representative to either stop, edit, or censor your dispatches prior to publication?
No, there was no effort by the government to interfere in any way in the publication of the dispatches. It's a very rare thing, I might say, for any government official to try and influence the Times in the publication or non-publication of the news reports of its correspondents. Occasionally such efforts have been made in the past, and I might say with a notable lack of success.
Have you been called on by any United States officials to discuss or give your impressions of your experiences in North Vietnam?
I made my way to Washington almost immediately on my return to this country, where I had rather extended conferences and consultations with many American officials, beginning, of course, with Secretary of State Dean Rusk and some of his associates. I brought back from Hanoi some extremely important observations and some reports of vital importance to our foreign policy based on my conversations with the North Vietnamese officials, including the Prime Minister, Mr. Pham Van Dong. And these, of course, I immediately shared with the highest officials in our government, who were, I might add, eagerly awaiting my return in order to find out what it was that I would have to report to them. I've also met at other times with the members of the Senate Committee on Foreign, subjected myself to their interrogation and questioning on all the various points which were interesting to them in connection with their continuous review and survey of American foreign policy. And I've also, of course, discussed some questions with representatives of the armed services.
What were the reactions to your articles as expressed to you personally upon your return by your colleagues of the press?
The reactions which were expressed to me personally were extremely favorable. I think it would be no secret to say that most of my newspaper colleagues were very jealous of the experience that I had had. It's an unusual one, and I don't know of any newspaperman of my acquaintance who would not gladly have changed places with me in Hanoi. They, I think, were quite sorry that they hadn't gotten there themselves, and at the same time they were delighted that someone in the profession had managed to achieve this undertaking.
In your opinion, is it part of a reporter's responsibility to encourage and promote peace feelers, or should he steer clear of political maneuvers and just report the facts as he sees them?
This is a difficult question to give a yes or no answer to, because reporters sometimes find themselves involved in the diplomatic process without really wanting to be. And once you're involved in it, I think you have to sort of go along with it. When I went out to Hanoi, I deliberately sought to avoid becoming involved in the diplomatic process by not going to Washington so that there would be no temptation on the part of anyone in the State Department to give me any message or any assignment to carry out when I was in Hanoi. Once I was in Hanoi, however, it turned out that there were some things which developed in the course of my discussions which were of extreme interest to those who formulate our foreign policy, so that I had nothing to do but to act, in a sense, as a conveyor of information, not all of which was news information. Some of the things that I was told off the record and could not report them. But that, I think, is just a hazard of the business of being a correspondent. It comes up every once in a while. I remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis that one of the most experienced reporters in Washington, a man named John Scally, who's now, in more recent times, I think has been with one of the broadcasting companies, was approached by an official of the Russian embassy who sought him out to give him some information which he expected and anticipated Mr. Scally would convey to the White House, which Mr. Scally in turn did. It wasn't of John's doing that he was put in this particular role, but once he'd been thrust into it, he had no choice but to carry it out. It wasn't for several years before he was able to report as a newspaperman what had happened.
Do you feel that you're in a similar situation, are colored by your own hopes or thoughts or beliefs?
The duty of an experienced newspaperman or correspondent is to report the news as objectively as he is capable of doing. I think that all newspapermen are human, or more or less human, and being so, they're not perfect, and they're bound to be little shades of differentiation that creep into the reports. I think that's true of even the most experienced of us, and I think that any honest reporter must admit that at some point there may be some subjectivism in his reporting. But the duty of a reporter, as I have understood it and as I have been trained over many, many years, is to at all times attempt to do his best to report objectively, to report the facts as they actually exist and as they are presented to him by the sources with whom he's in contact, and not to shade them or to permit his own emotions or his bias to distort them in any way. And I think any good reporter will come close enough to that objective so that the reader of his dispatches will have a free opportunity to make up his own mind on the basis of the facts.
Don't you feel that a correspondent should weigh his professional duties against the obligations he has to his country's welfare, and which, in your opinion, should come first? reporting the facts as he sees them, or his country, right or wrong?
All of us are citizens of our country first, and after that we are professional men, we're lawyers, newspapermen, doctors, or whatever life happens to hold out for us. So we start out from that standpoint, and we're loyal Americans, and we uphold the honor and the dignity of our country. Now, the role of the newspaperman is an unusual one in that he is the man who goes out and scurries across the world and into the highways and byways of the different countries and in our own country to find out what's going on, to find out the facts. He brings them back and he reports them so that you and everyone else will know what's happening in the world. He reports for the ordinary citizen, he reports for the members of Congress and for the people who make policy in Washington, because it's only on the basis of the most comprehensive and accurate reporting of whatever is happening in the world, whether we like it or not, and particularly the things we don't like are the things that ought to be reported, that accurate and intelligent policy can be made. Once you begin to put restrictions on the newspaperman, it's like putting blinders on a driver trying to take his car through traffic on a holiday weekend. He's not going to get very far. He's going to smash up pretty soon because he isn't going to know everything that's going on. In this world that we live in today, it's imperative that we know everything that's happening as much as we can, whether we like these facts or not. And particularly is it important for us to know a great deal about our enemies and what they're up to.
Did you then, or do you now feel that you were conducted only to places where you saw only what the Hanoi government wanted you to observe, and thus did not really get an accurate picture of North Vietnam?
Well, quite to the contrary. I saw those parts of North Vietnam which I asked to see myself. I traveled throughout Hanoi, the capital, quite at liberty to go in any place I wanted, quite by myself. Traveling around the country, I confess I did have to have guides and interpreters because I don't know my way around the country and I don't know the language. But I told them the sort of things I wanted to see and the areas and the types of activities I wanted to see. I told them the kind of people I wanted to talk to, the sort of interviews I wanted to conduct, and I was the master of the program and not they. You know, actually, it would be quite impossible for the North Vietnamese to take anyone on a conducted tour of their country. Most of us can't picture what that country's like, but it's a very small, backward country. It also happens to be very flat, and the roads run at some elevation above the countryside, so that when you start out across that country, you can see for miles and miles around, and it's almost impossible to hide anything. They didn't make any effort to hide things from me. It would have been futile if they had tried to, because I would have seen them anyway. And indeed, I saw a great deal, which I'm sure they didn't particularly like me to see, but there was no earthly way they could keep me from seeing it.
Do you feel that your articles and subsequent book might have supplied ammunition for the propaganda machines of the communist governments?
I think, on the contrary, that my articles and my book provided wonderful propaganda for the United States, and also it provided facts on which Americans who are interested in the foreign policy of their country, who are interested in its security in a troubled world, were able to make up their minds and arrive at intelligent conclusions. I was told on a trip abroad that I took not long after returning from Hanoi, a trip that took me into the heart of the communist world in Moscow. I was told by some Soviet Russian intellectuals, people who are not part of their government and who really are quite critical of their government, that when they read in their papers and heard over the Voice of America, as they did, because our government was intelligent enough to beam my reports all over the world, when they heard these reports coming in, that an American reporter had gone to Hanoi, and that his reports had been published in the New York Times and had been published in other newspapers all over the country, they for the first time realized that when Americans talked about democracy, they really meant it. This was not just propaganda. This was the real thing. This was something that could happen only in the United States and could never happen in the Soviet Union. I've heard from others, my friends and also my colleagues in Europe, that this was the impact of my dispatches in Europe as well. People said, America must be really strong. It really must be dedicated to its democratic ideals, or it wouldn't allow this sort of thing to happen. And I think that's true. And I think that overall, the effect of the book and the articles was one to give our country great strength and to improve its image around the world.
What were your personal feelings regarding the moral aspects of our involvement in Vietnam before you arrived there, and after your trip, did they change?
I suppose that I am somewhat unusual in this respect, but I try, in considering matters of foreign policy, whether our country is involved in it or other countries are involved, not to inject the moral issue. I know that most Americans have a great tendency to see foreign policy in terms of right or wrong, of black and white. I don't think one approaches these problems very intelligently when one injects this kind of moral judgment. I don't criticize people who have moral approaches to these problems. I simply don't adopt that approach myself. My approach to Vietnam, just as my approach to the Soviet Union or to the communist world or to Africa or the Middle East, my approach to any of these areas has to do with America's national interests. Are they being well served by the policies that we're carrying out? I have felt for a considerable period of time that serious questions could be raised about what we were doing in Vietnam, not on a moral basis, but on a basis of simple, sheer power politics. Power politics are not terribly popular in this country. We like to clothe ourselves in armor and ride a white horse into battle. But I happen to believe that the world is based on balance of power. It's an uncertain balance that exists today between ourselves and the Soviet Union based on the nuclear deterrent. We have enormous interests in various parts of the world. The most important ones, to my way of thinking, lie in Europe and in the Western Hemisphere. We have interests in the Middle East, and we have lesser interests in Asia and in the Far East, and the area of the world in which I think we have the smallest interests, actually, on a power basis, is Southeast Asia. To my way of thinking, a policy which commits the great force and treasure and wealth and American military might to the area of the world which, next to Antarctica, probably is least important to us, is sort of upside down. I had that view before I went out to Vietnam. I certainly had it when I came back. But I don't believe that I permitted this conviction to influence my report on what I saw out there, because I was not reporting on policy. I was reporting on the physical results of our air attack on North Vietnam, and I was attempting to find out what the Vietnamese government and people really thought as a result of that, and whether they were prepared possibly to modify their position on negotiations.